That was our responsorial psalm this morning, and it was a pretty good summation about what we're going to talk about today, which is the story of forgiveness. Now, I was told that the 8th graders were going to be here for this morning's session, so I spent several hours yesterday taking all the things out of the talk that I didn't think I wanted to have to explain to 8th graders. And now y'all are here, and they ain't. So I'm going to put them all back in, I think. And maybe this will work. So, you know what we've been doing all this while? We've been talking about the long, old story of our faith, the story that we tell every Lent and that we incorporate into our lives every Lent. And we said it's a story about sin and death. Starts off, we remember that we're dust. But that's also an opportunity to change, and even a mandate that we need to change. Some things need to die so that other things can live. It's a story about sin, because even Jesus doesn't get a pass from a world full of sin. And it's a story about power and how we use it, especially about the tremendous power of love. We considered the power that's in words and stories and how important it is for us to tell the right stories, to take the right stories to heart, because they move us to be the people we want to be. None of us wants to be who we are right now. We want to be the person God calls us to be so that we can be happy. That is the goal, to keep our hearts close to God's heart. And that leaves us with only one more story to tell, and that's our story, which brings us to the forgiveness talk. So we've had the story of change, the story of power, the story of forgiveness. Forgiveness is the bottom line in our religion, not judgment, not morality. Forgiveness. Forgiveness is the most important word in the Christian vocabulary. It defeats the power of sin and death. That's our gospel. That's our main message. That's what Jesus says we should take out to all the world. And sin and death are two enormous superpowers that forgiveness can defeat. And in fact, only forgiveness can destroy sin and death. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that without forgiveness, we don't have a religion. That's how important it is. And we can't discuss forgiveness in theoretical and abstract terms, because forgiveness has only one context, and that's human relationships, which are never abstract. You know, I could stand up here and talk about maternity all morning, but maternity is an abstract term. What if we talk about your mother instead? There's nothing abstract about your mother or my mother. Very specific relationship, a whole different conversation. Maternity is an idea, your mother is a relationship, and that's true whether your mother is living or deceased, whether she was a walking saint or a highly problematic individual, whether you love your mother or feel distant from her. In fact, it's a relationship whether you ever knew your mother or not. Your mother is not an abstract idea. So forgiveness involves very real people, very real relationships. So we can't spiritualize this issue. Theology will never do here. Forgiveness isn't like talking about the Trinity. It's not like memorizing some answer that's in a catechism somewhere and be able to recite it. When it comes to forgiveness, we're talking about you and me. We're talking about God and us. And there's nothing abstract about these relationships. And there's really no place we can hide in a conversation like this. And that's why it's the third uncomfortable conversation in a series of uncomfortable conversations that we have during Lent. But remember, Lent is a season designed for our discomfort. So that's why we're talking about forgiveness, even though none of us are anxious to forgive the people who harm us. So this hour, things are personal. We're talking about your story and my story. Forgiveness is always personal, and in fact, It can't be otherwise. Now, I learned this during my first theological debate when I was a child. It was after Sunday morning Mass, and all of us kids were piled into the car. We were heading for home. The gospel that week had been about Jesus teaching the disciples how to pray. Oh, our Father who art in heaven. And my father was saying what a fine homily he thought the priest had given. But before I had time to think things through, because I was a kid, there in the back seat, I burst out with, but what Jesus actually said was, we're supposed to forgive our trespasses the way we hope to be forgiven. And Dad said, yes, so? And I said, but Dad, doesn't that scare you because of Lucille? Now, Lucille, I should explain, is my oldest sister, and my father hadn't spoken to her for years. Lucille had been my dad's favorite child, but she disappointed him, so he disowned her. Now, I won't repeat my dad's exact response to my question that morning, but the gist of his reply was that the prayer about trespassing didn't mean that. It wasn't about Dad and Lucille. Jesus was talking about God and sin, and I should learn to keep my teenage mouth shut. So, what I learned from my first theological debate is that it's very easy to kid ourselves that church talk is just that. It's just talk. You know, it's Jesus and the prophets yammering on about spiritual matters, all the stuff that holds the cosmos in place. But church talk is not about the nitty-gritty details of our lives. Nothing in the Bible, in fact, is meant to have anything to do with our families and our jobs and the money in our wallets and the decisions we make or the use of our time. Religion is about spiritual things, about what I say when I pray, what I do when I'm in the church. Or, as a young woman told me recently, religion is between God and me, and Jesus and I are just fine. Though she admitted that things in her family were much less than fine. And, you know, we sympathize with this woman because you and I say also that we love God, but some days we just can't stand the people around us. So it remains true that if we get forgiveness right, we're on our way to getting everything right. But if we get forgiveness wrong, nothing in our lives and nothing in our world will ever be right. So, why do we have such a problem with forgiveness? Why is forgiveness so hard? Well, Christian writer Barbara Johnson says, it's because we are Easter people living in a Good Friday world. And I think that about sums it up. We are Easter people with a vocation to joy. We know this, but our world is a Good Friday place. It's full of pain, injustice, loneliness, loss. So how are we supposed to opt for joy in a Good Friday world? Well, some of us manage it by living in denial of the Good Friday world. Just pull down the shades and pretend it's not there. Christian writer Annie Lamott makes a joke about this. She says, well, you know, I've realized I just don't have the right personality for Good Friday. And she asks for a hall pass from the human condition. She says, me, I'd just like to skip ahead to the resurrection. In fact, I'd like to skip ahead to the resurrection vision of one of the kids in our Sunday school who drew a picture of the Easter bunny outside the empty tomb. She says, everlasting life and a basket of chocolates. Now you're talking. And she has our number. Lamont is right. Eternal life does sound better with the chocolates. But you and I really do get a cosmic hall pass if we reach for forgiveness. Because forgiveness is the diamond shining at the heart of all of our theology. But that diamond doesn't come cheap. Somebody has to pay the price. Now, most of us learn the need for forgiveness at an early age, and where I grew up in a small coal mining town in Pennsylvania, we all learned about the cost of forgiveness and the need for forgiveness in our world before we hit kindergarten. Now, this is the point where I dropped out some stories that I wasn't going to tell to the 8th graders, but I will tell to you. Because kindergarten was when my very best friend Rita found out that her dad didn't die in the war the way she had always been told. In fact, her dad committed suicide after he returned from the war. At that same age, right around the time we were starting kindergarten, another friend of mine, her dad made a fateful decision for his family. He had to make a choice between his family and his favorite bar stool downtown. He decided the bar stool was more important. And then I remember this boy down the street from our house who never came out to play. He would always sit in the big bay window and watch the rest of us through the glass. And when we asked the grown-ups about that boy, the grown-ups told us he was illegitimate. That was a strange new word to describe why a boy couldn't come out and play. As children, we absorbed our elders' prejudices. We learned who we could like and who we might legitimately hate from our elders. We parroted grown-up politics. We condemned our non-Catholic friends to hell. I remember with great sorrow the day that I told my best Protestant friend Nadine that she was doomed to everlasting suffering in hell if she didn't learn to love the Blessed Mother. And Nadine, of course, wanted to know where it says that in the Bible, but it made for a difficult afternoon. Now, I'm happy to say that Nadine and I are still friends today, but we also both still remember how terrible it was that day that we looked into each other's eyes and shuddered to think that a friend was going to burn in hell forever. What were we learning about God back then? What were we learning about the gospel, about the church? Some of us find it hard to remember a single radiant example of forgiveness that was ever demonstrated in our childhood. That's certainly true in my upbringing in a small coal mining town in Pennsylvania. We didn't do forgiveness. We did a lot of judgment. We heard a lot about exclusion. We learned original sin really well. We learned the wound of life in that poor little community. But few of us learned how to heal the wound of life, and some of us didn't even suspect that it could be healed, that there was a cure for what was wrong. Now, I learned an early lesson about the wound of life on the first day of kindergarten when Warren Hunt punched me in the stomach. Now, you think I wouldn't remember the name of a 5-year-old villain across all these decades, but you'd be wrong about that, because I owe Warren Hunt a punch in the stomach. And if he shows up here this morning, I'm tempted to take him out in front of the church and make him one sorry middle-aged man. Now, you may be wondering what I did to deserve this punch. All I did was sit next to a boy I didn't know in the circle of seats around Miss Kiley, our teacher. And then the strange boy hauls off and hits me with his fist and warns me not to say anything or he'll hit me again. Sufficiently cowed, I remained silent. Now, it might sound petty that I remember a punch all the way from kindergarten, but it wasn't just one punch. Because the next day, Miss Kiley informed us that we're going to take the same seats we took the day before. In fact, they were going to be our assigned seats for the rest of the year. So I sat next to this boy, Warren Hunt, again, and he punched me again and warned me not to tell, and I didn't. So now, whenever I think of kindergarten, I remember there was a blue seesaw. I remember we made turkey drawings with our hands. I remember learning how to write my name, and I also remember being punched in the stomach every day by Warren Hunt. I was scared to go to school, as you can imagine. I loved to learn things. I loved playing in the big toy room of our kindergarten, but I was afraid of sitting in that circle and being slugged. So I told my mom, "My stomach hurts in school." She said, "Why? I thought you liked Miss Kiley." "I do like Miss Kiley," I said, "but I'm afraid of Warren Hunt." So I told my mom what was happening in the circle, and she told me to tell the teacher. So the next day, I was happy to go to school because my mother had come up with a brilliant solution, I thought. I went right up to Miss Kiley that day and I whispered in her ear, "Warren Hunt punches me in the stomach." And to my dismay, she replied, "I know, and I'm sorry about that." I was stunned. Neither my mother nor I had considered any scenario that involved this development. Nor was I prepared when Miss Kiley continued, "You see, honey, Warren's parents are divorcing." And she whispered the word slowly as if it were the name of a rare disease that should inspire my pity. And back in 1963, divorce was pretty rare, and it did inspire pity. But I was having a very hard time in my 5-year-old mind connecting the dots between Warren's parents and my stomach. You know, I could see that if Warren's parents didn't love each other anymore, that would be sad and scary for this boy, but he was punching me. And my mom was waiting at home for me to figure all this out and straighten it out. So I went up to Miss Kiley again and I said, "Could you change my seat?" And I said it as sweetly as a 5-year-old girl can, "Could you just change my seat?" And that's when the full despair of the human condition descended on my 5-year-old head, because Miss Kiley said, "If I change your seat, he'll just punch some other little girl." And the world shifted 180 degrees on its axis as I realized that Warren would remain my nightmare, because he was going to punch someone, so it might as well be me. My teacher was offering me up as a human sacrifice to a wounded boy. She didn't know how to stop what was going on. I didn't have the power to stop it. So Warren continued to use me as a private punching bag, and I absorbed all the frustration of a boy living in a broken situation. So in kindergarten, I learned how to print my name, and I also learned another lesson that I never forgot. I learned that violence is in the world, and it has to go somewhere. A terrible lesson to learn. And I was having a really hard time yesterday trying to figure out how I was going to explain that to 8th graders. It was the wrong lesson to learn, that violence is in the world, and it has to go somewhere. Well, that was 40 years ago. That was 1963. Does any of this matter in 2023? Obviously, I'm still telling the story. I'm still waiting for Warren Hunt to show up at one of my parish missions. Does the whole legacy of our lives really play into the mystery of forgiveness? You know, only to the extent that our hearts today are the precise size that love has made of them. You know, we can only know and believe the things about forgiving that we have received and witnessed about forgiveness so far. And if we haven't witnessed it, how will we know about it? If we haven't experienced it, if we haven't shared it in our own lives, how will we ever know about it? Now, years ago, I co-wrote a book about forgiveness, still thinking about Warren Hunt. Not because I'm an expert on the subject of forgiveness, but because I just realized how badly we need it. Now, I called my book The Forgiveness Book because I didn't want to be mysterious about what was inside of it. I wanted the people who need to find it to find it. So I called it The Forgiveness Book. It's the central task of all of us living in a broken world. Because we all live in a world in which the sins of the parents are visited upon the children, and where one punch will surely lead to another. And we all know that forgiveness isn't easy. We don't want to do it. We hate having to forgive those who trespass against us. And trespass is a word that we usually see on a sign that says, "No trespassing," with barbed wire around the property to reinforce the message. We hate forgiving people who cross us after we went to all this trouble to put the barbed wire around our lives. Don't they see the signs? And as much as we hate to forgive trespassers, we also super hate to have to seek forgiveness ourselves. Because if we have to seek forgiveness, that means we are the perps. We did something wrong, and we really don't want to accept that. We'd rather just wrap another layer of barbed wire around our lives and our situations to keep the intruders farther away than ever. Because the one thing none of us wants to say, not to God, not to anybody, is I was wrong and I'm sorry. Now, for the record, Warren Hunt never said he was sorry to me. Miss Kylie said she was sorry, but I didn't believe her because she was the teacher, she was the grown-up. It was her job to protect me, and she wasn't very good at it. So as much as I don't want to forgive Warren Hunt, I totally don't want to forgive Miss Kylie. She's also never shown up at any of my parish missions. But I also know what Jesus said about all this. He said, forgiveness is a two-way street. Forgive your trespassers, you get forgiven your trespassings. Otherwise, the barbed wire stays up around my life and Warren's life and Miss Kylie's life and your life. And what kind of a world is that to live in? Now, today's helicopter parents would never have stood for what happened to me, right? They would have swarmed into a classroom like my kindergarten with their lawyers in tow. But in the 1960s, my mom who had 5 other kids at home to take care of, in an age when parents respected the teacher's sovereign right to govern their own classrooms, my mom did nothing about this. So should I add my mom's name to the list of people I'm never going to forgive? And then how about Warren's parents? Because it was their troubled marriage that led to Warren's frustration to begin with. And if I insist on keeping the list of people I am not going to forgive, if I hold everyone bound to my injury, the list will grow infinitely long. Warren, Miss Kylie, my mother, his parents, all the people, all the factors that led a miserable couple to end their marriage in the first place. Which is why it's no good for us to talk about sins. You know, sins in the plural, as if they're little pellets of wrongdoing that are singular, isolated, and unrelated in this world. We talk about Jesus taking away the sin of the world because sin is a matrix. It binds our histories together. And this matrix, otherwise known as original sin, never absolves you or me of culpability for the wrongdoing we do. You know, if I punch you, you can hold me responsible for this. But what this matrix of sin does mean is though I may harm you today, you will surely harm somebody else tomorrow. Nobody is innocent on the battlefield of sin. That's what it all means. No one's hands are clean when it comes to the sin of the world. So what happens in kindergarten is a tiny matter, perhaps, but multiply each punch across a society or across the world. On any given day, who's doing the punching is maybe up for grabs, but so many punches have been delivered throughout human history, across centuries, it's really hard to pinpoint who the original perpetrator was. And if I'm the puncher today, as a result of an earlier injury I received, is my assault justified? Does a retaliatory punch remove the sting of the original punch? And are we making progress in all this? Are we any closer to solving the problem? Does it ever stop the pain? I think human history does nothing so well as to prove that the matrix of sin will never resolve itself. That much is clear. One good punch always seems to deserve another, and if we can't heal the first one, if we never go back and heal the first one, it will invariably lead to the next one. That's what human history teaches us. So forgiveness is the only thing that will solve the matrix of sin, God's forgiveness. It's the new blueprint from which history is remade. Through forgiveness, our rescue from the old design of sin and death is finally possible. So, a sin-sick world is the problem. Forgiveness is the solution. It's the only solution. Our religion teaches us this, that forgiveness is the medicine for everything we did and everything we failed to do. And that's plenty. So, why wouldn't we receive this gift with open arms? I mean, it sounds like a great deal. All we need to fix the world is forgiveness. Well, the problem is that you and I want to hold somebody responsible for the ways that we have been trespassed. We don't want to let anything go. We have all suffered far worse things than a punch in the stomach, I am sure. We all want justice for this. And what we mean by justice is even Steven. We want someone to pay. Real grievances demand real redress. The pursuit of justice is not a trivial thing. But if we're honest, we're not always in the market for justice. Often what we really want is retribution. We want to make someone pay for this. And you all know the saying, holding resentment is like eating poison and waiting for the other person to keel over. It doesn't work. Forgiveness, in that sense, sounds like a better destination once we realize that the alternative is self-destruction. So it's forgiveness or self-destruction. What do you want? It's challenging enough, though, to forgive the people we know, the perpetrator with a face. There's all these other faceless trespasses that we have to forgive, too. Like the subprime mortgage fiasco of 2008. It wrecked the world economy. Maybe some of you remember that far back. I do, because I lost a house. Like a lot of people lost a house. How do we forgive the legions of somebodies in banking and government who threw the whole world economy into the septic tank? I was trying to figure out how to explain septic tank to people who might not have one. Homes, jobs, savings were lost overnight. And it's not just one recession. There's a whole lot of recessions. We've been in a recession just recently because of the pandemic. You know, and I sit down with my tax lady every year, just like you do, and she told me back in 2008 that I shouldn't even think of retiring until I'm 70. Well, I'm 64 now, but as sobering as that idea was that I couldn't retire until I was 70, lately my tax lady is telling me that I can't retire until 10 years after I'm dead. I have to forgive somebody for this, but I don't even know who. I have to forgive everybody who voted differently in the last election from me. And I have to forgive everybody who's going to vote differently from me in the next election, which probably includes some people here, so please know I'm working on it. I'm really trying. But I hope you can forgive me too. God bless America, really, really and truly. We just have to put an end to all the division, to the demonization of people who hold different opinions from ours. Because we're all really, really tied to our opinions. We like them. That's why they're our opinions. Our Eucharist shows us how to do all this, how to work it all out. Because we say it's the new and everlasting covenant for the forgiveness of sin. That's what we say. It's for the forgiveness of sin. It demonstrates how we get to be many parts, yet one body. And that's why we all try to stand during communion time to acknowledge that. And we're still working on it. We're still working on it. People are in different places. Many gifts, one spirit. Many perspectives, one common good for the sake of all. That's what our Eucharist tells us. It's the message of the forgiveness of sins. But there's a difference between a punch in the stomach and serial punches that are aimed at the dignity of an entire group of people, and we know that some people are constantly being pummeled just because of who they are. So how can forgiveness help that? Well, forgiveness is serious business because the greater the offense, the more we need forgiveness, not less. The more forgiveness is vital to come into the situation, because we are living in a world now full of nuclear weapons and they're aimed to kill. And we're living in a world that's full of terrorists that are vowed to destroy, which means that forgiveness isn't hopeless. What it means is that forgiveness is more necessary. We need larger spiritual armies. Please join me in this. Become part of the spiritual army committed to reconciling grievance. We need more healers that are vowed to restore what's been lost. And so the greater the harm in the world, the more we need to forgive. And popes and presidents have been trying to do this for as long as I'm alive. They do their part to reconcile the sins of the world. They offer official apologies for things that happened long ago, these historical atrocities like the clergy abuse scandal, the institution of slavery, the attempted genocide of native peoples in this country. And I wonder, do such apologies help? Can words alone promote healing, especially healing of things that happened so long ago? But if we wonder about this, we might remember 1995 when South Africa showed us the way. Because South Africans had a lot to forgive. So they performed a commission. They formed a commission called the Apartheid Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Remember all this? So if people came to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and publicly told the truth about what they did during apartheid, if you publicly told who you murdered, if you publicly admitted where the bodies were buried, if you expressed remorse for what you did and you were willing to work toward restitution, you wouldn't go to jail. You wouldn't be executed. You would not be held for your crimes at all. Just imagine. All you had to do was get up and tell the truth, a political form of confession. What we're talking about here is the power of words, that the black community in South Africa was willing to accept the words of white people who killed them and say it's enough if you just admit what you did, say you're sorry, and work toward restitution. They believed in the power of words. They believed that everything has to begin there. Do you and I believe this? Do you and I believe that the confession of sins transforms the human soul? How much faith really do we have in the power of reconciliation? Pope Francis says everything counts on it. He urges us to build bridges in our world, not more walls. But how do we deal with all the social walls that are already in place, that have been in place for generations? Are Jews ever going to be able to forgive Germans for the Holocaust? Really? Can Palestinians ever forgive Israelis? Can Hiroshima and Nagasaki ever forgive America? Can Americans trust the countries who perpetrated 9/11? Will there ever be reconciliation between world religions, between men and women, between gay people and straight people, between the races, between conservatives and liberals, between the advantaged and the disadvantaged all across our planet? How do we reconcile all that has gone wrong? How can we reconcile all the differences of opinion? Now, we have to be very careful about how we answer this question about the plausibility of forgiveness. If we say it's impossible, if we say no, forgiveness on this scale is not possible, we're being cynical about the chance to get it right and restore hope. What we're saying is Christianity is useless. Christianity is phony. These things cannot be forgiven. But we come into this space all the time, and we worship a God who, at the centerpiece of our religion, is nailed to a cross. And he's nailed to a cross at the heart of our assembly to remind us that forgiveness is the centerpiece of all that we do. So do we believe that this is possible, or are we cynical about this and say, no, it can't happen? There's too much wrong, too many punches. Now, Christianity claims that forgiveness saves the world, and it's the only thing that ever has. It's the only thing that can. But if we don't believe this, we're never going to accept this transformative power for ourselves. And we're not going to be able to bring it out into the world if we don't believe in the power of forgiveness to make a difference. And I think one of the problems is that we have learned to compartmentalize forgiveness into one sacramental moment of our lives, confession, right? Confession is the forgiveness of sins. So we're going to limit God's mercy to that single act in the life of the church. But forgiveness is actually the essence of every sacrament. Eucharist is the primary sacrament of reconciliation. The church teaches this, not confession. Eucharist is the primary sacrament of reconciliation because at every Mass we say it is the new and everlasting covenant grounded in the forgiveness of sins. So our Holy Communion was never meant to identify the worthy among us. Our Holy Communion is meant to knit heaven and earth back together again. This is our cosmic supper that tells us that forgiveness of sins is possible. So confession is a sacrament of forgiveness. Eucharist is a sacrament of forgiveness. Baptism, obviously, is a sign of our forgiveness. Washes away the authority of sin's deadly effect in our lives. The anointing of the sick is for the forgiveness of sins. Jesus liberates all those that he heals from sin as well as from disease and sickness. And of course, any married person will tell you, if you don't know marriage is all about forgiveness, going in, you will learn that very shortly. And priesthood becomes the culmination of all of this. It's a ministry of reconciliation by means of the administration of all the sacraments. So it turns out that the mission of the church is not to get everybody to go to church. The mission of the church is to heal a broken world, and the way we do that is to bring the gospel of forgiveness to the ends of the earth. That's why we're here. So how did a lot of us get the idea that the purpose of Christianity is to learn how not to commit sins at all? I mean, that's certainly more or less the message I got. That I'm supposed to get to the point where I don't need forgiveness. Thank you very much. I'm a good person. Well, that's a nice idea, that somehow we're going to get to a point where we don't commit sins at all. But it overlooks the obvious, big obvious thing about Catholicism, the sign of the cross. We make this sign as soon as we enter our sacred space each time. And the cross hangs over our assembly. We begin and end all worship with this sign. We mark every child with this sign at baptism. We're going to be buried under this sign in the end. The sign of the cross is a big deal. It's a gesture of cosmic reconciliation. And that's why it's the most frequently repeated sign in our religion. And yet, many of us will still imagine that Christianity is not really about the forgiveness of sins. We persist in thinking that religion is about getting our moral ducks in a row. So we're trying really hard to get our moral act together so that forgiveness will not be necessary. Maybe for you, not for me. I'm going to be good enough so that God can save all that divine compassion for the next guy who actually needs it. This is tragic. That you and I might imagine that we can win heaven by being good enough for it, by earning it. Jesus didn't die on the cross so Catholics could go to Mass on Sunday. Jesus died to reconcile a broken world, a miserable world, so that all of us could be once more united with God. And I keep repeating this, I know, because I know some of you are resistant to this idea. I'm resistant to this idea. I become a very unlikely evangelist for reconciliation because I don't teach forgiveness because I'm good at it. Please understand. And I certainly don't come from a family that practiced forgiveness admirably. I come from a long line of people who never touched the stuff. When it came to forgiveness, that was not our bag. My family legacy is the legacy of unforgiveness. We were real good at that. And the legacy of unforgiveness in my family bore all the traditional fruits of unforgiveness: domestic violence, child abuse, alcoholism, drug use, divorce, racial prejudice, clinical depression, mental illness, jail time, and more than one suicide. My family is weighted down with blame and shame and hard hearts and rejected relatives and oceans of tears. In other words, my family may not be so different from your family. I don't know. But human beings are a matrix of brokenness. And brokenness will be our destiny without forgiveness. You and I have to therefore become militant about forgiveness. We have to join the spiritual army of forgivers, not because we're good at it, but because the world so desperately needs it. Now, I mentioned earlier that my dad had a falling out with my older sister, Lucille. And we younger kids used to call her Saint Lucille because she was the perfect daughter. She was the soul of obedience. She was the light of my father's eyes. She drove us crazy. But that same Lucille grew up and married a Mormon, and she left the Catholic Church to join her husband's religion. And this was back in 1975. My dad almost had a heart attack. He didn't speak to Lucille for 30 years. And I prayed all those years that he would. He wouldn't come to our family reunion if she was going to be there. She wasn't welcome in our home. I prayed all those years that rupture would be healed. Because what got ruptured just wasn't the one relationship between Dad and Lucille. Of course, it was the whole family. Because if Dad could disown the favorite child, the good child, the perfect child, what chance did the rest of us have? I, by the way, was not the perfect child. Our annual holiday table became a firing squad. My sister wasn't there. We were forbidden to speak her name. We all wondered who would be next. Actually, Diane was next. We were divided in our souls. We were divided in our deepest loyalties. So one by one, my brothers and sisters and I, we quietly peeled off. We grew distant. We stopped coming around. Being with Mom and Dad was too much of a headache because Lucille wasn't there, and Lucille couldn't even be mentioned. Being a family that banishes its own, it was hard, too hard to bear. And my mother, of course, becomes collateral damage in all this because she suffers the loss not just of one daughter, but gradually of most of her children as we came around less and less. And then came the year that Dad was diagnosed with cancer of the everything. They found it too late. He had only a few weeks to live. And I prayed that he would pick up the phone and call Lucille. I prayed every day, every hour. I prayed for my dad to find the courage to give her this gift, to forgive his daughter for not being who he wanted her to be. And I also prayed that Lucille, after 30 years, would have the generosity to forgive him for not being the father she wished he had been. And honest to God here, I wanted to find the strength to forgive both of them for the loss of my family, the family I once had and knew. I hoped all these things would happen. The year of Dad's cancer could be the year of our family's healing and reunion, I thought. It should have been the year because he didn't get another. He was 80, his life was ending. Lucille was 56. She had children and grandchildren that my father had never met or acknowledged. I remember thinking in those last miserable weeks, if not now, then when? We had a narrow window open for reconciliation, and then it closed, and Dad was gone. And unforgiveness became my father's legacy. He spoke it on his deathbed clearly. He wrote it ferociously into his will. My father did not want to be reconciled. What my father wanted was to be right. Please don't make this mistake. Please don't value being right more than you value the people you love. Please don't make the mistake my father made. Now, from a human perspective, this ending seems hopeless. We ran out of time. We didn't get to fix my family. But the view from eternity is different. Because we all know that Dad was always one decision away from wholeness. We were all one decision away from being a family again. And even now, as Catholics, we believe that the chance to make things right is still with us. It resides with us in the communion of saints as we pray in that cosmic exchange between our prayers and Dad's present condition. through my family's prayers, even now, my father, my sister, all of us together might still find our way to home. And I tell this story at parish missions to honor my father, not to dishonor my father. I want to assist him in the work of reparation. And if telling this story helps other families avoid the peril of unforgiveness, then it helps my father, and we all become whole together. Now, I mentioned that I wrote a little book on forgiveness. I wonder why. Back when that book first came out, I was invited by my pastor to speak about it on that Sunday and sign books afterwards. So after Mass, after they mentioned that I was going to be speaking on this book called The Forgiveness Book, after Mass, a woman I didn't know physically grabbed me in the aisle and said, "Why did you write this book?" So I recommended we talk about it in the church hall where I was supposed to be signing books, if she could just walk with me to the book table. And as soon as I reached the table and started to try to sign the books, the woman approached me again and said, "Why did you write this book?" And I said basically what I've been saying to y'all, that forgiveness is the key message of Christianity. This answer did not satisfy her. So she asked the question again, and I told her, because forgiveness isn't an option, really. Not for Christians. Forgiveness isn't something we do because we're nice people. We do it because God forgives us first, and it's our turn. But she impatiently snarled her question at me again. "Why did you write this book?" So I said to her, "Because my dad never forgave my sister." And then she smiled. And she said, "Okay, I'll take 5 of them." She didn't want theology. None of us want theology. What she wanted was my testimony. Because forgiveness is personal. It's what I've been saying. Forgiveness is personal. She wanted to know that the pain and the frustration and the brokenness of the struggle that she was struggling to forgive the people in her life wasn't going to be overlooked. Because anybody who tells you that forgiveness is about saying the magic words, it just hasn't been there. It's a lot harder than that. And my friend Erin taught me this, because her dad was the one who chose the bar stool over his family when she was 6 years old. And because of that choice, Erin didn't get the life she might have had. She said it all the time. As an adult woman, I met her when she was 60. She said, "I didn't get the life I might have had because my dad walked out on us when he was 6 years old." He was either absent or drunk or scary violent every time she saw him after that. And Erin's brother ended up following her dad's footsteps. He repeated the same problems with his family. And Erin's older sister had a teen pregnancy, often happens when the father leaves, followed by a series of unhappy marriages. So what chance did Erin have to get it right? Her family was all messed up, so she never married at all. She never had children. She fought depression most of her life. Erin poured herself into a 24/7 job, just trying to fill up a terrifying inner emptiness. And then one day on her lunch hour, she visited a Catholic church that was near her office. Now, Erin wasn't Catholic. Her father had been Catholic, but that was not exactly an endorsement for the church. And Erin had been in a Catholic church exactly once in her life with her dad after the death of their grandmother, and together they had lit a candle for the grandmother. She had this very clear memory of that. So 40 years later, she's standing in a Catholic church once again, and she decides to light a candle. It's the only thing she knows how to do in a Catholic church. She stood there and she watched that flickering flame in the darkened church, and it occurred to her that maybe what was missing from her life all these years was not her Father who art on earth. Maybe what she was really missing was the other guy, the Father who art in heaven. So on the spot, Erin decided she was going to become a Catholic. That's all it took, one lighted candle. She joined an RCIA. She came diligently. It was my RCIA, so I remember. Shortly before Holy Week, though, Erin vanished. She returned just before the rites of Christian initiation at the Easter Vigil. And her sponsor asked her where she'd been. And she said, "Well, I couldn't join the church without making things right with my family." So she jumped on a plane during Holy Week and flew to Iowa to see her mother. And then she called her sister in Denver, who she hadn't talked to for years and years. And finally, she flew to Los Angeles to see if she could find her father. She located him at last in a veterans nursing home. By then, he was so mentally impaired by drink that he didn't even know who she was. It didn't matter. Erin sat with him, talked with him, held his hand, and found pity in her heart for this broken, lost child of God. She decided not to hold him responsible anymore for what he had done, for what he had failed to do. Instead, she just let him go. And I can tell you that Easter, no one was more prepared to greet the risen Lord than Erin, because she'd done her homework. She'd not only embraced reconciliation for herself, but she embraced it for her whole family. She became that lighted candle against the darkness. Because when she had lit that little candle in that Catholic church that day, she had already embraced the light of Christ into her heart. She understood that forgiveness is not just something that nice people do, but that it's necessary, it's non-negotiable, and most of all, she learned that forgiveness is possible. It's the only light that withstands the darkness. Now, in our world, one good punch always seems to deserve another. Retaliation is, in fact, respected. Anything less seems cowardly. But beware that the creed of retaliation brings no one back to life. The creed of retaliation does not close the wound. It does not lead to peace. It never restores what's lost. The gospel of retaliation only prolongs the season of darkness, keeps the pain alive, and as we nurse our indignation, the world becomes increasingly more dangerous. So we can make a choice. We can fill the world with enemies and fear and aggression, or we can love our enemies. And we know which way Jesus is going on this issue. He says, love your enemies. Because when we love an enemy, there is no enemy. When we love an enemy, the enemy is already conquered. All we have left is a brother or a sister. And when Jesus describes his kingdom, he always describes it in these terms. It's a realm of forgiveness. It's where the shepherd seeks the lost sheep, and the woman finds the lost coin, and the lost son returns home. And Jesus tells these stories over and over again because even his friends don't seem to get it. You know, Peter, his loyal foot soldier, asks, do I have to forgive the same person over and over again for crying out loud, Lord? And how shocked he must have been when Jesus says, yeah, that's what I'm saying. Forgiveness is so fundamental to our religion that Jesus looks down on a paralyzed man, sees his need, identifies an even greater need, so he assures this paralyzed man, your sins are forgiven. And we can hear the crowd murmuring, is that all you're going to say? This man can't move. And you're offering him forgiveness of sins. But sin is what truly paralyzes us. It what keeps the world in stasis. It's why forgiveness has to come first. And forgiveness also has to come last. Because Jesus makes forgiveness his final legacy on the cross. He's suffering, he's dying, he can hardly breathe, and with his very last breaths, he forgives his crucifiers, and then he turns to a nearby criminal and says, you're coming with me to paradise. It's all about forgiveness in the end. This is the Jesus way. Turn the other cheek, forgive people their ignorance, love your enemies, to which you and I respond, are you crazy? Maybe it is crazy. But you know what's even crazier than that idea? The world as it is. Would you not agree? The world is crazy. Conflict, terror, injustice, violence, class war, racial tension, ethnic cleansing, religious condemnation, divided families, broken hearts, bereaved communities, fatherless, motherless children. Crazy? That sounds crazy to me. If you and I don't want it to do it the Jesus way, if we think turning the other cheek is too much to ask, well, then we're going to pay this other price, the world as it is, and which is more expensive. I have one last story to tell. This is a story about my friend Dale. Those of you who have been here the last 2 days have heard stories about Dale. He gave me a lot of gifts in his last season, and this story is from earlier in his life, before I even knew him. But it was a story he liked to tell. It seems that Dale started out as a small, skinny redhead with a bad stammer, and kids used to make fun of him for speaking funny. And after one such beating, Dale sprang up and he offered his hand to the boy who hit him, and he said, "You won, it was a fair fight, so let's be friends now." And the bully was so confused by this response that he beat Dale up again. Now, Dale didn't come from a religious family. So when he grew up and he started traveling around the world's religions fascinated him. Of all the wonders he saw, all the beautiful buildings, all the amazing things, the greatest marvels always seemed to concern the religious quest. Magnificent houses of worship everywhere in the world, rituals and throngs of earnest pilgrims seeking their God. So Dale studied Arabic so he could attend mosques in Egypt. And he studied Hebrew so that he could learn to pray in the synagogues of Israel. And later, when he came back home, he decided to practice Buddhism at an ashram. Dale was so attracted to spirituality. He was drawn to the practice of prayer, but he couldn't seem to find the place where God was waiting for him in particular. So he just kept looking and collecting. And Dale had seasonal work at a ski lodge in Utah because he loved to ski. He was a great athlete. And while he was there, he noticed a Trappist monastery down the road. I always find it ironic that he found Catholicism in Utah. Curiosity drove Dale to spend a weekend at the monastery, and he liked the quiet. And he started going to the monastery regularly, and he began a conversation with a monk there named Father Patrick. And the conversation lasted for years. Dale would ask him questions about God and Christianity, why things are done the way they're done. But he'd also argue with Father Patrick every time he saw him. Why does the church teach this, and how could you possibly believe that? This conversation went on for years. No matter how many questions Dale asked, he was never satisfied with the answers. Dale wanted clarity. Father Patrick offered mystery. And one day, Dale arrived at the monastery to be told that Father Patrick would no longer visit with him. The monk had nothing else to say, nothing to offer in answer to all these questions. So Dale panicked. He sent word that he had to meet with him just one more time. He promised he'd go away after that. He didn't. But he said, "I'll go away after this if you just meet with me one more time." The monk continued to send back the reply he had no more words to offer. Dale begged, and finally the monk relented, and Dale was shown into the parlor where they normally met. And Dale was sitting in a chair when Father Patrick entered. Silently, the monk went over and knelt down in front of him. He took off Dale's shoes, and he kissed Dale's feet, and then silently he got up and left the room. And Dale wept. And all the barriers to understanding fell away, because he finally understood who Jesus was, and he found that he had no more questions. He was received into the church that Easter. Our God is a humble servant. God sets a table and feeds us just because we're hungry. God sends us the Spirit because we're lost. God forgives our sins because we need it. So in the forgiveness of sin, please understand what's happening. Jesus is bending down, and Jesus is kissing your feet. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.